on mute?
Yeah, I'll mute everybody. Hold on one second. All right, so just Denise and I are.
Yeah, I unmuted me, you remuted me.
I know.
All right.
I'm going to go ahead and do just a couple.
Sam will,
let me do a couple things first, like announcements, and Jeff's going to have something. So first of all, we're going to keep everybody on mute throughout the thing, but if you do, Denise, are you okay with them breaking in for questions? And I'll also watch the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. And also watch the chat. Yep.
Yeah, and I'll just read the chat. If John can help me monitor the chat as well, that would be great. And just like cell phones, just stay on mute until we can, whatever. And then Jeff Schwager has a Nature Visions update, so we can go ahead and do that really fast if you want to unmute yourself. Now he has to unwork.
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so just real quick, because I know, in case you haven't heard or don't remember or didn't see the email, but this year's Nature Visions is kind of canceled for the expo itself, like us being at the Hilton Center. I was kind of wanting to have things kind of a little more organization before trying making any announcements, but just be looking for emails from me. Even though we canceled kind of the main event, we are still going to do the student competition. We are still going to do our regular competition. And with that, we're doing the change with new rules. So you'll have, the regular nature part is normal, and then you'll have the expanded photo art with the categories and everything. I don't know the exact number yet. Right now, we're kind of discussing between having 5 in each major group, so 5 in nature, 5 in photo art, or it might be 6. So we're kind of somewhere around there. And we don't know what it's going to be yet, or what the cost will be, or if there will be a cost, but we are going to have some type of virtual, kind of keynote-ish type of thing. So we might have a couple classes, we might have just one keynote with a speaker, but just be on the lookout for that, because we're kind of formulating that a lot right now. And I don't have a ton of details to kind of over promise too much, and we don't do too much, but I'm guessing we'll probably have, at least one keynote with probably a speaker for like an hour-long time, and maybe broken up into a couple segments, or who knows. I just want to make sure everybody knows that there'll be more announcements to come with all of that. But to be ready, because I should probably post this on Facebook or something, but what the original timeline was for our images. It'll be probably something close to that. This time I'm not gonna have to collect images, and we're not gonna have to mat them or anything. So we're gonna have a few more days to play around to submit. But just think about you'll probably have till about mid-September or something to submit images or something like that. So just be ready for that when we do open it up. And I will make sure everybody stay aware of everything. With that, I'll mute myself.
You might need to unmute yourself. I have a question. Is the count the same? Like what people can put in?
The count for the number of images?
Yeah.
That will be a little different. The like I was saying, the nature side will be either 5 or 6, and then for the photo art side, we'll up to 5 or 6 as well. So we're still we're trying to figure out the numbers, and because these numbers will probably carry over to next year, because we just only have a certain amount of display space. We're moving, so just in case anybody cares about the inside baseball, we're moving everything over to Merchant Hall now. Beacon Hall will probably not be used anymore, so the photo art exhibit will also be in Merchant Hall with or around the nature exhibit, just to kind of get them together and more people can see the photo art stuff. But obviously that won't be until 2021.
Right.
Cool. All right, I did mute myself.
Cool.
We had a mowing thing going on. It's pretty loud. Anyway, we're gonna meet virtually until otherwise notice changes at Lansdowne. And then, but I wanted to ask everybody for their opinion if you want to continue doing these through the summer, because it won't be hard to find extra speakers and stuff like that. So if that's something you guys want to do, feel free to just say yes or no, whatever. And then our next virtual meeting is competition, and that's May 28th. I didn't double check that number, but I'm pretty sure that's right because that's 14 days from now. And it's macro themed, and we have a judge lined up for that. That's my dog, sorry. And the upload folder is the exact same link as every month. I just clean it out. So if you want to go ahead and start putting your stuff in, you can go ahead, but after today, I'll send out a message with the link and everything. All right. And if you also have a topic, sorry, like every dog has decided to bark. If you have a topic that you'd like to learn about or something, just feel free to email me. And we've been doing, Denise and I were doing some classes, mainly Denise, and almost every other week. And then Marion and I are doing some stuff every week. So we've been doing that during the day and at night. So if there's something that you're interested in, let me know. So I'm going to do a quick introduction, but I'll let Denise introduce herself mainly. But as many of you already know her, she's a nature, landscapes, and travel. I'm going to shut my door. Hold on. There's all these adults in the house. You'd think they'd know. So Denise is a nature, landscapes, and travel and more photographer, and also the owner and co-founder of Roadrunner Photography Tours. Her interest in photography started when her grandmother would share images from her travels to Egypt and Africa for safari. 35 years later, Denise was inspired to embrace photography and more, specifically travel photography, and Roadrunner Photography Tours was born. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Denise, and she can tell you more about herself and get started.
I don't got nothing else to say. Most of you guys know me from club. But like Sam said, we do own Roadrunner Photography Tours, and we do tours. And although all of the tours for 2020 have been canceled, we have just recently started posting for 2021, starting off with Costa Rica. We have some space, a little bit of space because of the changes that happened with this year's trip to Africa. We actually ended up with an extra week, so we do have more space for Africa. And then we'll be looking to do Patagonia again in the fall, so November timeframe. And there might be other things popping up. It's just sort of taking it as a wait and see now, but that's what's currently on the schedule. So check it out if you're interested. Today we're going to talk about long exposure and the idea of just creating a sense of motion. And I'm going to talk about different kinds of techniques, both handheld techniques as well as tripod techniques, and then the gear that would be related to either. Okay, come on thing, go. There we go. So why would we do long exposures? Well, really for me, the idea here is that it's just an alternative way to express your vision. And the idea is it's going to show a passage of time, or it's going to have a sense of motion. It'll capture a different mood. And I kind of feel like if you're standing outside taking particularly nature photography, but even just people and city and street photography, you might be capturing everything at, 1/500th, 1/1000th to 1/8000th, depending on the light. And just realizing that if you stop that shutter down, you're going to just create a different type of image. So this next image is taken in Dettifoss, which is a huge waterfall in Iceland. And if you've ever watched Prometheus, the little guy from Prometheus actually fell off the edge over here where these people are in the back left corner. So anyway, so we're facing opposite to it now. But anyway, so this is taken at a full, as I tell you, say 1/750th of a second, f7. Everything's sharp, really. I've got enough depth here. I can see my little people over there in color, but I've got this stop motion on the water, which is not really how one experiences a waterfall. Water doesn't move like that for us. We see it falling. And you can also see potentially on the left third here, there's a very faint rainbow. And at the time that I took the photo, I kind of was in a hurry. I just dropped everything and got my camera out to take the image because of the rainbow. And as you can see, I barely captured it. And part of it is to do with the fact that I'm only accumulating light for such a short period of time. So when I finally got my head on straight, I took the shot again. And other than slightly different crop, there's a totally different image here. The rainbow now is much more distinct and has had time to sort of fill in itself in with the capture. This is a 1.5 second. We're not really talking a very long time, but yet you can see this amount of water passing, and it has a much softer and a much smoother feel to it. So the idea here is you get the sense of the falling water instead of it just tack sharp. So long exposure photography is like one of my favorite types to take. It takes a little bit more time and a little bit more effort. Obviously, the first one could have been handheld. Don't know honestly if it was or not. This one cannot be handheld. It needs to be on a tripod. So it's a bit different experience, but it creates to me, a more compelling image. This is called Mount Storm. If you've ever gone to West Virginia, Blackwater Falls Park, State Park there, you will generally, if you're going out the big superhighway there in West Virginia, you're going to pass Mount Storm. It's going to be on your left on the way out, right on the way back. And we would stop whenever the smoke and clouds looked interesting. So this is a photo of it. It's not any particular photo of it. I've got hundreds of these, but the light was kind of interesting coming through and the clouds being backlit. This is probably taken on a different day, and it looks really bright on my computer. It's not blown out in real life, but I don't know what it looks like for you guys. But this is just taken at almost a minute. And you can just see the kind of intensity of the wind now because it's taken with such a longer lens, or shutter speed, excuse me. You're going to get that motion from the wind blowing the smoke and after the smokestack. So just a kind of it's a different feel, a different time of day, conveys a different message in terms of what my experience was when I stand there taking it. So what time of day is best? Well, frankly, I think every time of day is fine for this type of photography if you have the right gear. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But obviously sunrise and sunset, twilight, obviously you can do a lot more with lower light. You don't necessarily need gear depending on how dark it is. Overcast is really nice because you don't get hot spots. But quite frankly, middle of the day, it's absolutely appropriate. And I have some shots in here that were taken at high noon, and I'll share those. So there's no limit. And that's the other nice thing. If you have the ND filters that you need to do this stuff on a tripod, frankly, you can do it whenever, which is nice. It opens up the day. So creating long exposure images, there's a couple different ways to do this. Handheld techniques, which we're going to talk about, are panning. The idea of capturing a motion blur, and there's a couple different ways to do it, but generally the idea, the primary idea, is to capture your target, your subject, in motion and pan with it so that the background and things around the target show the movement, and yet your target stays reasonably in focus. And you see this a lot in like car ads. You see this a lot going through the sunflowers and the lavender fields in France, where they've got their, the sports cars going through, but all the flowers are blurred. That's kind of the idea that we're going for here. Then you also have swipes, and you can do horizontal and vertical swipes. So we'll show examples of both of those. And then just some camera movement, which is really here about intentional camera movement, intentional camera shake, not that inadvertent stuff that happens whenever we're trying to handhold something that we want to be really sharp. And then tripod technique. So the idea here is about manipulating the camera settings or the lens that you're using filters, and then taking advantage of the time of day also works great here if you are limited in your filter choices. And then lastly, you can create motion through post-process. Like you can use Photoshop to create motion, but it doesn't have the same effect and doesn't give you sort of the same feel in general. It's much more limited, and I'm not doing a deep dive on that. So we'll start off with some handheld techniques. So how you would do this basically is you want to go to manual, generally to manual. I often shoot in aperture, and I kind of force the shutter speed to where I want it through the exposure triangle. But manual is an easier way to get here. You want to determine what you want to get the blur, like what's the right exposure for the blur, the 1/15th, 1/30th of a second. You want to be able to make it look deliberate and yet not like a mess. So it depends on your scene. You can either pan with the subject, or like I said before, you can do horizontal swipes to achieve your desired effect. And a lot of these techniques is really about practice makes perfect. It doesn't, you can't just assume that because you did the motion or you tried to pan that you're going to, one, even get your subject in the frame, and two, get what you want for the desired effect. It's one of these things that it could be 100 or 200 or 300 shots to get 1 or 2 good shots. Let's talk about panning. Since we're not there to demonstrate it, but the idea here is that you're kind of panning, and this is really about preference. You can pan left or right. It's whatever is most comfortable for you, or what direction your subject is actually moving. So you kind of have to practice it both ways. But basically, it's a general motion, like you get the subject and you follow with it. That's the idea here. Here's an example of this is taken on the boardwalk in Wildwood, outside of Cape May, and these ladies were going by. I was gifted with the fact that they had 3 different colored bikes, which was awesome. So I did go with selective color here. That was just a different kind of preference so that I wasn't distracted by the sign behind her head and the colors and other things that were going on in their clothing. But they're riding down the boardwalk, and clearly the lady in front it's actually not very wide open, but she's who I focused on. Everything else kind of moved to a blur. And she's pretty sharp, her face in particular, and then everything else is blurred out, and it's because I'm tracking, and she's where I focus. So this is the idea of panning here. Also the same location, different trip to Cape May, but same idea, trying to catch him, and he's not moving as fast as this lady on the bike, but all that means is I have to temper the pace of my pan so that I stay with my subject to get everything else into a blur. Here you can see I'm actually at f18, and part of the reason, and I'm actually at 200 for ISO, it was bright enough that to get any motion behind him and not get everything sharp, those are sort of the parameters I had to push my camera to get any motion in the image. Just it was so bright that day. Even though it doesn't look bright, it was bright enough. This image was taken on a road trip, I think in the backwoods of Virginia, quite possibly towards West Virginia. And I was practicing some Don swirls, and he was driving. Doesn't happen very often. I did most of the driving for these because he liked to play with them, but in this case he was driving. And the idea behind this shot is that I'm kind of my target is coming up in the front corner of the car, right? The front right corner on the passenger side. And I saw the flag, so I basically faced the camera to it, and then as we came by it in the car, I'm turning and moving through my passenger window, and this is 1,000% luck. There's no other way to put it. We did not go back to try this over and over again. I just happened to get the flag with some reasonable clarity that it made sense, and it's actually a color image on a very gray day in winter. That's snow on the ground, all the trees are bare, white sky, just kind of boring day otherwise, but it worked out well here. This is definitely one of those situations where it could be 1,000 to 1 before you get something that you really like. So horizontal swipes, we're probably all kind of comfortable and used to doing things like this. So in this case, you're basically moving back and forth, and you can move one direction or you can move back and forth continually until you get the image that you want. So here's an example of a sunset taken up in Shenandoah off of one of the overlooks. It was actually quite a lovely sunset, but not anything interesting, right? So it was kind of pretty, but there was nothing going on. And the big wide view of this was dull. And so I tried to entertain myself by zooming out, right? So instead of taking a wide shot, I thought, well, I really like the colors like way out in this background, like way out past those lights. So I thought, let me just zoom out and see what I get. So this is the shot, and it's more interesting, but it's not any more interesting that I would want to share it with anybody. So there's contrails in there. It was a long road trip for a short beer, and I stayed there kind of deflated by the whole idea. And I look off to the side, and Don's kind of making, he's rocking back and forth, and he's like, oh my God, what are you doing? And he's like, well, I'm taking a swipe. And I'm like, well, I hadn't even thought about that. And it just didn't occur to me. So part of these things become behavior. You have to teach yourself to take a moment and think differently so that you can take advantage of the fact that you're standing someplace and there might be more images to capture. So so I decided I'd try a swipe, and I stayed zoomed out because, again, the wide image didn't really work for me. And I ended up with this. And basically all I'm doing is just moving side to side and trying to hold the camera straight so I wasn't getting a wave. I just moving my whole body, over the whole torso, with my arms pinned in. And again, this is not like a tremendously interesting image, but to me it was a tremendously more interesting image than the last one. It was the suggestion of a sunset. It was a suggestion of a time of day and of a mood. And I just found it more interesting. I've not really ever done anything with it. It's a good example of sort of the thought process. Some of them turn out tremendously well, some don't. This is taken in the Palouse, and
hey, Denise,
I'm sorry, what was that?
One quick question. When you're
Yeah,
photographing.
that's a no, Danny.
Oh, good.
That's a no. So for people who aren't looking at the chat at the same time, so Danny's asking whether or not on the street I am getting permission of those people walking and biking. And the short answer is no. You do not need somebody's permission to take their picture, and particularly in a public space. If you're in a private space, then that's different. If you're in a building for a company, you have different concerns. As long as I don't turn around and I, say they're riding by on those bikes with a Coca-Cola can, and I think I want to sell that to Coca-Cola, then I need permission to sell their imagery. But in and of itself, to take a picture, and vice versa, if somebody's taking a picture of you, you have no right to privacy in public. And I will say that if people wave me off, and this is true of my street photography in general, so it's not specific to swipes on the boardwalks, but if somebody waves me off, there are a million people within a block of me, almost anywhere I'm going to go except now in my life. And if somebody waves me off because they don't want their photo taken, I am not going to force myself on them. There's no need for that argument. It's no need for the stress. You just, hey, I'm good, no problem. And you put the camera down, they go about their business and you move on. I've got people who, when they realize their picture's taken, they sort of look away. It is what it is. I've never had anybody stop and be confrontational with me. And we've sat at cafes in downtown DC having breakfast and mimosas, taking pictures of people walking through Adams Morgan. And every now and then someone will come by and say, well, what are you doing? And our answer is usually, we're just having fun, just taking people walking down the street. There's interesting, you got a great hat, or you've got a cute face, or whatever the answer was. We were honest with them, and we told them straightforward what we were doing and why we were doing it, and that we were hobbyists. And I've never had someone tell me to delete a photo. And then there's been times where I've had people stop and say, look at my cute kid, and hold their kid up for a photo. So it's, I guess the short answer is I don't need it if I'm not selling. And frankly, I could sell that image. If you said, oh, I love those bikes, can I have that? I'll buy it from you? I can sell it 100 times. No issue that I'm selling that photo. It's my work. The issue comes in when you are selling an image so that somebody else is going to make money off of somebody's likeness who didn't have a say. So I can't put it up for stock and sell it, but I personally can sell it. I hope that answered the question. So anyway, this is taken in the Palouse, Washington State. If you've never been, it's a really tremendous place to go. These beautiful wavy fields of grain, generally noted for its puffy blue, big blue skies and puffy white clouds. Today, not so much. It's sort of this steely gray effect. And I liked the colors and everything, but I wasn't really feeling the image. And so I decided to do some swipes. And obviously this is a totally straight out of camera, not processed. There's nothing going on. The next one is processed, so that's part of the difference. But it just was boring. And even though the light was cool. So same location, waiting for light. The light basically moves through the clouds in this place, so the sun rolls over the hills. And I decided to do some swipes. You can see in this case, I'm at 1/200th. I mean, I'm not even slow. I'm just moving, personally, I'm moving fast to get this horizontal swipe. And again, not the same image, just a different feel, different play of light. I've cropped it a little bit differently to get the sort of banding and tiers of color. But, to me, a more pleasing image. So even if I processed the other one, I would never have done anything with it, which is why it was never processed. So we'll talk about, so those are horizontal swipes. We'll talk about a little bit about vertical swipes now. This is the motion for vertical swipes. a lot of us, at least when I started doing this, we'd just move our hands, right? We would just kind of go like this. And what I found is that I didn't really create an image that I liked. It didn't have this sort of straightness that I wanted in it. And again, learning just from paying attention to what Don was doing over time, like I just learned, he would move his entire body. So it was a whole torso rocking motion, you know, with his arms tight. And so that's how I do it now. And the result is like tremendously better. So if you're going to do this, you are moving up and down, but instead of trying to just move your wrists in this motion, which gets warble in it, you know, if you move your whole body, it's just this one big arcing motion and so much better in terms of your end result. So look at what happens. I think this is taken in West Virginia, probably outskirts of Blackwater, that area outside of Davis. It's either that or Shenandoah, but I'm almost positive this is West Virginia. And, you know, I can't tell you how many times I've looked into a forest in that part of the world and thought I saw something, and then I get it home and I hate it because the forests are messy. And this is a prime example. I saw something totally different than I actually experienced in the photo. So here is basically the same image, obviously again processed and cropped, but in this particular instance, I'm doing a vertical swipe of those trees. So because I'm moving my whole body, I get nice straight trees. And really what comes through here is the fall color. I no longer have that sort of drab undergrowth that happens, or that attracted me, which was the fern, but it doesn't look that way. And I've also added a texture. I mean, I've done a few things to this image, but the end result conveys trees in fall without being so like in your face about fall color. That's boring. So even if I had processed this green fern would have been an eyesore. No matter what I did with it, it wouldn't have had the same sort of appeal as going and getting rid of all of the sort of rubbish that are in the forest and going straight to what I was trying to convey, which was fall color in the forest. Same idea here, taken at winter. This was taken off of the road that goes up to Dolly Sods in West Virginia. And it was taken in October. It was years ago. It was an early snow, and it was snowing pretty heavily. So as we came down the mountain, we came into this like little stand of trees, and they were super dark, but the wind was pushing the snow against one half. So only half of the tree had snow attached to it, which is why the forest has this look to it. Same idea though with the swipes. So camera movement. Now, I'll be honest, pretty sure that all of these photos are Dawn's. I'm not even going to try to say they're mine because it's just not something that I do. But I always loved his work here. I thought it was super creative. So we'll talk about them and I'll tell you what the motions were, just because over time I've learned about it. It's just not something that I do with any regularity. This is actually a field of either grass or wheat or something. And I can tell you that having taken enough shots like this, it's just sort of dull and boring on its own, but he played with the camera. And so he's not really he's doing a little bit of a swipe type of a motion, but he's also doing it at a diagonal with a little bit of like turbulence in it to get this wavy field. And honestly, I find this a hugely compelling image. The wheat on its own is boring. To me, I mean, I've got lots of it, but this just has a different feel, and you feel like it's, you know, the wind is blowing or a storm is coming in. It just has a totally different mood to it. So this is, like I said, this is a diagonal kind of a swipe with a shimmy to get the effect. This next image was taken outside of where you could do the Trillium shooting up in the George Washington forest, I think. I'm not quite sure what the place is called. I can like literally never remember. But it is where Trillium blooms in the spring. And we'd finished shooting Trillium and we were getting ready to leave. And I did take a shot. I didn't take this shot, I took a shot. And basically what this is a picture of is through these trees that have yet to bloom out to the sunset, the bright yellow-orange spot here is the sun going down. And my shot is just uber boring. At the end of the day, nobody's ever seen it. This might quite possibly be one of my most favorite shots. Just because it has the sense of it being trees, but it also feels like flame as opposed to a sunset. So I love the warm and the cold in it. It's just I've always been one of my favorite shots. And So it, again, same kind of idea. It's a swipe, but with like a little shimmy on the motion. And I tried it. I saw what he was physically doing, and I tried it. Never captured anything quite as interesting. I just think this is spectacular. So this is another type of motion. Basically, it's sort of that what I'm trying to convey here is the shimmy. I don't know why it's where it is. Actually, it should have been before the slide, so I need to fix that. But that's basically what the motion looks like with the camera. This is another one. These are petunias. Again, as I said, all these shots are Don's. This is a thing he's mastered. But basically, if he had just shot this straight, you would have seen all of the like little petunia flowers, but you'd also have seen the dirt, and you would have seen the twigs, and you would have seen the weeds. You know, there would have been things that you would look through the flowers to the ground because they're not far enough away to get a really nice soft bokeh behind it. So instead, you're getting that sense of spring. And in this case, the motion is just an arc with the camera. That's what he's basically doing, is creating a little arc. But I like it. It basically conveys the message of a change of seasons or spring blooms without it being sort of static. So it's got a different kind of feel to it. And this one screams spring and a Hallmark card to me. In this particular instance, and I've got a picture coming up of what the motion is, it's little circles. So he's basically standing in front of a planted area. So I don't know if this is like something he passed on the way to work or whatever, his own yard, that part I don't know. But basically he's looking at, again, spring blooms, multiple colors, and the motion with the camera is a little circle. And I don't know if this is also a multiple exposure or not, because I know his Nikon camera does that. But again, probably another one of my favorite images, just because it tells you, it gives you the message without being so direct. So anyway, just another thing. This is what that motion looks like, basically. All right, so those are the handheld techniques. Basically anything that you can think of to do with your camera, any kind of motion, you know, experiment and see what you come up with. You don't have to follow any of these techniques, but you know, you'd be surprised at what you can create. And it's not to say that you don't take the static shot too. You can and enjoy it. But recognize that before you walk away, there might be something to play with. And I think that that's really more broadly something I've had to teach myself over the years, because I'm a really fast shooter, and I tend to feel like I'm done and ready to move on. And I have to really settle and start thinking for myself, like, what can I do here? I'm here, I've driven a long way, or I've flown a long way. Is there something else to be had? And in addition to the tripod techniques we're going to talk about, these handheld techniques are just another aspect of a way to explore different photography. So gear and settings for the tripod techniques, basically this is a basic set of tools right here. Now I do say have a sturdy tripod. This is not particularly a sturdy tripod. This tripod is literally like this big, but it fit the photo. So you do want a sturdy tripod, and part of that is that your exposure could be from, you know, a 20th of a second, anything you can't hand hold, so a 1/6 of a second, to 10 minutes, 15 minutes. So you want to make sure that you're not adding camera shake to the image just because you have your tripod is not sturdy, or the wind blows, or whatever. You want some kind of gear that's really going to be planted when you're going to be doing long exposures on a tripod. In general, having a remote shutter release or a self-timer, I'm not a big fan. Well, self-timers, I'm fine. I use a cable release like the one you see here. That's pretty typical of what I'll carry. You can use a wireless, you can use your phone. I will tell you that from my experience, they do not connect readily enough or maintain their connection often enough that I've ever really wanted to rely on the wireless technology for shooting. A lot of wireless in my life, but for shooting images, it's not where I gravitate to. So I use a wired remote, or I use an internal timer, like a 2-second timer, so that I can trigger the shutter, but I can get my hands away and let the camera settle before the shutter releases. We're going to talk briefly about all the filters. The primary filter for this stuff, though, is going to be an ND, which is a neutral density filter. But we'll talk about what graduated and polarizers are, because I think there can be some confusion around that. And then the idea of flash. I would say in the last month of my life, I've been playing with a flash for the birds that we're shooting on the deck. I do not carry a flash, and I don't use flash for long exposure, but I'll explain how it would be used. So some settings. Do you shoot RAW or do you shoot JPEG? I shoot RAW, and I would tell you that if you're currently a JPEG shooter, I think you need to start making that progression to shooting in RAW. And maybe that stepping stone is you shoot RAW and JPEG for a while so that you have that JPEG that's been processed by the camera to sort of think about when you're looking at the RAW image, because RAW images are boring. They don't have any sharpness. They're sharp as you're going to get them, but you have an added sharpness. They do not have saturation. They don't have contrast built in. None of that sort of secret sauce that happens in your JPEG from the manufacturer. So a lot of people get frustrated when they start to make the shift because they look at those RAW images and they're not what they don't see what they like. They don't see what they saw. So for people who are making the shift, I would say shoot them both so that you can have the reference of the JPEG as you're processing the RAW file. And then once you're comfortable, move to RAW. And the primary reason is that there's a lot more pixel data to work with. You can retain a lot of, or bring out detail in the shadow while you're bringing down blown out highlights. There's a lot more information there, so you can salvage things. Much easier to adjust a white balance because it's not baked in. And the other thing to do in general, and this would be even with JPEGs, is exposing to the right of center so that you're lessening your noise, because you can always add back shadows. For shutter speeds, most DSLRs max out about 30 seconds before you need to go to bulb. I know that on the Fujis, they have a time feature that you can actually go up to multiple minutes now. That was in the later years of a firmware update. And then, but if you don't have that, then you'll need to go to the bulb feature on your camera if you want much longer exposures. And then use your cable release to lock the bulb. So if we go back to this cable release here, if you see it, it's kind of probably hard to see, but it says lock on one side and start and stop on the other. That's the white. But right above that is this little kind of indented button. And if I push that in and push it up, it locks. And so if I don't push it up and lock it, I could just use it as a trigger without touching the camera, so I can trigger it instantly. But if I want a 3-minute exposure, I would push that in, lock it up, and then the screen, once it's turned on, would count. I just watched the count till I got to the time that I wanted. So that's what I mean by using the locking feature when you're in a bulb mode. If you have a mirrored camera, I don't, but if you do, then one way to reduce camera movement is to actually use the mirror lockup mode, which basically gets your camera that half step to the shutter release, so that when you're taking a long exposure, you're not getting any camera movement created by that lifting of the mirror. And in terms of noise reduction, whether that's a long exposure or ISO or HDR noise, I mean, there's like a couple different noise reductions. Turn them all off. There's like zero need to have those in your camera ever, let alone in a long exposure. But there's so many products on the market now that reduce noise and really add some beautiful like contrast and clarity to images at the same time. There's no reason to let the camera do it. Now, the reason for long exposures in particular that I say turn it off is because if you have, say you're taking a 3-minute exposure, your camera is you're going to lock it up, the shutter's open for 3 minutes, you stop the exposure, your camera is going to cycle a 3-minute shot with the shutter closed. So basically what happens is you've got the picture you took, the camera now takes another 3-minute exposure that's basically black, and it compares those two things. And in its comparison, part of what it's doing is identifying where it thinks there's noise and then removing noise with the black image. The problem with that, you know, if you really have all the time in the world and you're not trying to say catch a sunset going, passing, or getting an activity that's passing over time, then maybe it doesn't matter that it takes a 3-minute shot. But if it was, say you took a 15-minute exposure and now you're going to sit there for 15 minutes while the camera takes a blank image. If you were in a setting where it mattered, the sun was dropping, you wanted to take as many images as you can, or you're trying to get the splashing water in Iceland on those icebergs, and you just don't want to waste time while your camera's taking these black images. Frankly, that iceberg could go back out into the ocean before you get off 2 or 3 shots because of the waste of time in between. So short answer, turn off the noise reduction so that you don't go, your camera doesn't go through that process. And if you have noise, fix it in post. Nice thing about tripods, if you're not in any kind of hurry, you can just go to a low ISO and reduce your noise that way, so it's almost a non-existent issue. Excuse me while I take a beverage here.
So while you're doing that, Denise, so real briefly, so if if people take your advice and turn off the dark frame exposure, which is what it's doing for another long time, are there any techniques that you would recommend, or can you talk briefly about what's the best way to deal with the things like hot pixels and color pixels, etc.? Is there a technique that's a favorite of yours for that?
You talking about super long exposures that you end up with?
Yeah, like for example, I know that you've done a number of borealis shots and stuff. I mean, so how did you deal with the artifacts that would come from a long exposure in those?
So interestingly enough, my goal. So I actually, and I see this conversation. I'm going to talk about several sets. Jason, to your comment about the square holder, I don't use it. I use threaded ones. I will talk about how I get over that issue of having several. So John, so to answer your question, a couple things. In an Aurora shot in particular, the settings for that tend to be between, say, 1600 ISO and 3200 ISO, but I really try not to. If it's really rolling, you'd be surprised. You could probably have your ISO around 800 to 1000. Now, if it's really active, you're actually trying to drive maybe a second or two shutter. So you're not really getting a really long shutter on that. You're trying to get the fastest shot you can to get sort of what you're seeing and keeping detail within the Aurora. If you have a 5-minute shot of the Aurora, you're going to just have a green smudge across the sky. So you're really not trying, even for that matter, 5-6 seconds tops. At the point you get to 8 seconds, you really start to lose detail. So there's this really kind of weird calculation you're thinking about, like, how do I stay to 2 or 3 seconds, 1 or 2 or 3 seconds, getting enough light into the image itself so you have a foreground, and your darks are not so black that when you try to open it up later, everything looks like pixelated. I don't want so much time that I have a just blur. And part of that for me, part of the solution is I tend to go try to shoot auroras these days when I have about a half a moon. So waxing or waning, doesn't matter which half, but there's a little bit of moonlight so that the foreground is lit automatically by the moon, and it helps me drive down a shorter shutter speed so that I get my detail. So in terms of your question, Aurora is not really the right example. Where I would say the example is, though, is imagining going out and trying to do star trails. And even when I first started doing those, 4 minutes on my camera was about all I could get. By the 5th minute, I would start to get either see the pixels or get like magenta coloration in the image, in the corner of the image where there was light leak. So I think that the best answer to that is that if you're going to go out and you're going to try to do, aim towards the North Star and get your star trails, is to drive 3-4 minute exposures, whatever sort of the max capacity for your camera, and then just shoot hundreds of them. So instead of trying to do a 30-minute long exposure and get the whole circle, take them in pieces and then just use Photoshop to bring them back together. Like, I think that's really the easiest answer. So it's really about managing that. Even with Phil, the only time I've ever really taken a super long, I've taken a 30-minute sky shot, and there was no light to be had. It was, out in the middle of a forest in California with no cities around. So I didn't have any problem with light leak, and I wanted to just see what would happen. And I think it was about 19.5 minutes long. No, 1900. I think it was a 30-minute shot. And then the longest I've taken with a filter is 15 minutes. And on that, I basically wrapped the hat around the camera and the lens, and the eyepiece so that it didn't accumulate any light to get light leak. So there's kind of the ways that I handle that. I'm generally lazier than that. I don't have the patience to shoot like that. So Jeff will pile up a bunch of filters and take one shot every 10 or 12 minutes. That's not my gig. So it's just not, I'd rather take more shots than super one long shot. So. But I'd say the easiest way for the light leak is to just minimize it, just take more and blend them in post later. Okay, anything else out there that I need to think about? No. Okay, so how to do this, you got to determine your exposure mode. For most of my shooting, I will tell you, I take it in aperture priority. Although I've been doing a lot of manual shooting here just to drive the shutter speed I needed to get the birds that are moving fast here. But in terms of long exposures in particular, I will probably tend to be in an aperture priority and use the rest of the exposure triangle to drive the shutter length that I want. If that's not working, I might switch it to shutter priority, but probably would go straight to manual. And in particular, like the swipes out of the car, those tend to be in manual mode at like 1/15 or 1/30th f8, so that I'm getting a decent depth of field, and an ISO that at least gives me enough light to get the image that I'm looking for, basically is how that ends up happening. Like I mentioned for the auroras, again, 1 or 2 seconds, as low as an ISO as I can get that I'm still accumulating, but making sure that I don't surpass. So like actually the auroras, I might stay in aperture priority as long as that I'm able to create a 1 or 2 second shot and I'm getting the results I want. If not, I'll go to manual. You need to determine your composition. So now we're thinking about tripods, so we're not trying to think about swipes when I say that, but determine what it is that you're trying to shoot. And it's all the same rules that you would use for composition anyway. What's in the frame, what's out of the frame, what should be, do I have something random coming in from the top? Am I, do I have my subject in the proper place? Do I have a leading line? All of the things that you would ask yourself about your composition, those are the thought processes. They don't change just because you're doing a long exposure. And then determine the focal length that you need to have in order to get the desired depth that you want into the image. And generally on landscapes and in long exposures in general, I tend to be between around an f8 and an f16, but there's no hard and fast rule. Maybe I want my subject, which is more in the foreground, to be what's in focus, and then the waterfall in the background to be a soft blur, both with motion. Maybe I'm wider open. So it just depends on what you're trying to achieve. Now, focusing is different depending on the type of camera you have. So I tend to gravitate, this part of it would be true regardless of the camera, but I would tend to gravitate to starting with an autofocus, getting basically the focus that I want, switching to manual so that my camera doesn't hunt when I hit the shutter, and also dialing in the manual focus to make sure that I'm exactly where I want to be. And I use focus peaking on my camera, which basically gives an edge to whatever is in the focal plane. It'll have an edge. I keep mine to be red so that I can see that in my viewfinder. Now, because I shoot a mirrorless camera, I actually am able to put on my ND filter first, and I am able to focus through the ND filter. So 10 stop, even in bright enough light, I can focus my camera through a 15 stop filter. If you have a mirrored camera, you would either have to be in live view, so you're doing all this work through the LCD, or you'd have to do all this stuff first and then put your filter on, making sure you've gone to manual so that when you do hit the shutter, it doesn't start seeking because it can't see through the filter. So how you get to focus is kind of dependent on what kind of camera you have. Now for stars, it's really good to sort of understand where infinity is on the lens that you're going to use for your shot. Some people tape their lenses down and they have a specific lens for night photography so that they don't ever have to change it. I actually don't subscribe to that behavior. When you're out someplace and it's super cold, that might work great if it's ambient temperatures in the 70s, between 60 and 80 at night. But if you try to do something like that, say in Alaska, and you're doing night photography, your lens focus will travel as the camera contracts, the metals contract because of the extreme cold. So what might have been in focus at 10 o'clock at night may no longer be as tack sharp at 2 o'clock in the morning because it's gotten colder and it just moved off the sweet spot. So something to think about when you're doing stars is understand how to get to infinity and understand how to do that in the dark, and understanding that you have to kind of adjust it every now and then. And infinity on any camera, you just can't dial to the little infinity symbol. You need to find the sweet spot because it exists and it's not where the symbol is. So it takes a little bit of practice, but once you've understand how to do it, it's easier to do. For stars, if the moon is around or there's a street light far enough away or a light on a house down the road from where you are, you can use those to start your autofocus. Once you're past about 30, 40 feet, everything's in focus. It's all infinity at that point. To slowing the shutter, the idea here really is to use filters to block light, and then that will force the shutter to remain open longer. And the longer the shutter's open, that more motion you're going to get. So let's talk about filter options. So neutral density filters, this is a 6-stop. It actually doesn't look particularly dark here, but ND filters tend to come in, depending on the brand, 3, 4, 6, 9, 10, and 15. Now, funny enough, it says buy 77 millimeter and get step-up rings. I just had to go out and buy an 82 because all my gear is different, and the lens I would use it on is 82 millimeter, so now I have extra ND filters. But the solution to what Jason mentioned here about having to purchase many is I buy one, $300 filter, and I buy a set of $20 step-up rings. So in the case of the new gear, I would go out and I would buy a step-up. I would go through, I can either do it as separate rings or as a set. I prefer them separate. So if my filter's now at 82 and I have a 72 or a 67 or a 62 or a 58, I would buy, a 58 to 82, a 67 to 82, a 72 to 82. And now I'm using that one beautiful piece of glass on all my lenses, and I don't have to spend the $300 or $400 multiple times. So I don't carry a ton of these. Now, I do carry more than one because I might carry a 6 and a 10 when I go, or a 6, 10 and a polarizer or something like that. So I do carry multiple filters, but I'm not carrying, 4 10-stop NDs, one for each lens. So the cheap way to do it is get step-up rings. And I just have never bothered with the brackets. Like I think the best glass on the market for ND filters is Breakthrough, which is what this is a picture of. It's the only brand. Ben Rowe is really good too, but they'll warm the image. They'll give it a slight warm tone. Breakthrough, the image changes. There's no color cast to it. So I would rather do this. Lee filters go to magenta. Stingray, Lee filters, I think, go to blue. Magenta is Stingray. So different filter brands, when you have a long enough exposure, start to bleed in a color. And the only filters I've ever experienced that don't do this is Breakthrough. And they're out of San Francisco. We do have a link on our website to get to it. And I just think they're literally the best glass out there for filters. So there's the graduated ND filters. These are really, they can be used to slow a portion of the image down, but really that's not what their purpose is. Their purpose is for toning the sky or the foreground. So if you're trying to darken the sky, pop the clouds, but not impact your foreground and make it dark, you basically hold it sort of the way it's shown here on the screen, which is the dark side is at the horizon and the clearer side is down at the foreground, and you hold it in front of your lens. Now, I don't carry these. I don't, and for a particular reason is that imagine you're taking a wide vista and there's a mountain out there and the sky, you're trying to tone down the sky. Well, when you hold this up, this little piece of plastic doesn't know the difference between this is sky and this is mountain and that sky. It's going to darken everything at the point in your lens. If this is your lens, it's going to darken everything from its, wherever you've placed it on the horizon line. So what I think is that when you go, now you've darkened an image. So if you think about the way noise works, noise exists in the shadows, and when you open those shadows up is when you see the noise, right? So it's something, it's not anywhere actually, but it's when you try to take dark areas and make it brighter that you see noise. So if you hold this up and you take this mountain scene, and if you think about the pictures behind me would be a good example of this. If I were to hold up one of these ND filters, the trees would be dark, the mountain in the back would be dark, and I might get the sky to do something that I want. But everything else is now dark, which means in post, I have to go lighten up those areas. And depending on the circumstance, I might be adding noise to an image that didn't need it, when I could actually use a graduated filter in Photoshop or in Camera Raw or in Lightroom and tell it not to touch those areas and only tone the sky. So for where I want what this does, I actually just do it manually in post. There are people who want to do this in the field, that's fine, but I would ask you to think about it next time you do it. Are you trying to light up something that would have otherwise not been lit? And if you'd taken it without it and did it in post, would you prefer the image at the end of the day? So something to think about and something to try, but it is why I don't carry these. And not only that, you couldn't stack enough of these little halves to drive a long shutter. So they are dark, they look like filters, they are ND filters, but they're not really meant for long exposure. Polarizers, depending on the polarizer, you can actually get stops of light out of it. In fact, I just bought a polarizer from Breakthrough, which is a 6-stop polarizer. So it's actually 6-stop ND filter plus a polarizer. Haven't experimented with it yet. Literally just got it this week. But I thought to myself, well, when is it ever that when I'm trying to go for long exposures, that I would be offended by a darker or better pop in the sky? So I kind of decided I'd give this a shot and see how it works. But they're not really meant to push along a longer or slower shutter. So something to think about. They will add a little bit of time to your shutter speed to get what you want. You might get some softer water, but they're primarily used to remove glare and water and add saturation to colors. So I wouldn't necessarily buy this and think that I was going to get what I wanted out of a long exposure. So determining your correct exposure in these images, again, if you're shooting a mirrorless, this is going to be a no problem for you because you can shoot through the filter, your camera will automatically calculate the exposure that it needs, and you'll take the image that you want. But if you're on a mirrored camera, you're going to have to do a little bit more work around this. So basically what you do first is you obtain a reading. So without the filter on, you hold up your camera into your, to the direction of your composition, and you look to see what it tells you that shutter speed's going to be. And maybe it says, in the example I'm going to give you, we're going to use 1/250th, 1/250th of a second. Once you get that number, now there's a calculation that you can do. You could do it mathematically, I suppose, if you knew what the equations were, but there are tricks for that. And what you'll end up doing is now, after you've got your composition and your focus, you go into manual, you put your filter back on, and now you're going to have to adjust the shutter and basically go to manual and adjust the shutter. So as usual, there's an app for that. And this is called Long Time Exposure Calculator. This happens to be a version for Apple, an iPhone, but they do have it for the Android systems. So basically what you see is you basically tell it, I'm using a 10-stop filter. If it was a 6-stop, you'd put a 6 here. Then you basically, I'm using a 10-stop. My camera told me that the proper exposure was 1/250th. So what it basically tells you is the time with the filter, you're going to need to set your camera to a 4-second exposure. That's how this works. These little apps are great, but if you don't want to carry the app or you don't want to blow your battery, whatever, you can always go online and download it. And you can see here that the math is the same. So if on the left-hand column, you go to 1/250th of a second, go across to 10, it says 4 seconds. So the math is the math, whether you print this out, laminate it, fold it, stick it in your wallet, or carry it in your phone. This will tell you that based on what your camera reading is without the filter, how to know what the length of the filter is to get the proper exposure and a long exposure at the same time.
Hey, Denise, talking about
Yeah.
filter, do you find that there are variations, but can you trust that a 9-stop filter is always a 9-stop difference?
Yeah, you know, I don't know. I will tell you that that adding a 6 and a 3 to get to 9 is not the equivalent of a 10. So in that sense, and I know that that seems like it should be straightforward, but you're like, well, damn, one's a 9, one's a 10. That's pretty close, right? And it's not the same. So, and like here, George says that his 16 stop performs like a 14 or 15, depending on light conditions. You know, I'd say that's probably true of all of these. You might have to do some other manipulations to get what you think is what you want. I don't know that I ever thought about it, because for me, I don't really care what the stop is. What I'm trying to drive is a particular image. So and my go-to filter is always a 10 stop. I've found, like, I owned a $400+ 15 stop. I never, ever used it. I didn't have the patience for as long as I had to wait. I didn't like the results. It just wasn't my gig. So at the end of the day, what I carry for my photography is a 10 stop. I will occasionally carry a 6. So if I wanted to get to 16, I could. But it wasn't like, oh, I need all 10 stops, right? What I was trying to get is a particular look. And if I could put the 10 stop and do that pretty readily, fine. If I couldn't get it, say it was still too dark and I was getting too much white water, not enough contrast, not enough, you know, movement, because now it's moving so much, it's all blurred, I might have to go to a 6 stop and come at it the other direction and try to create it the other direction. So I don't know that I've ever thought about it, but I would agree with George. Probably depending on the conditions, you're going to get sort of a different result. I wouldn't so personally, like I said, I wouldn't so much worry about, did I get all my 10 stops out of it? It's more like, did I get the picture I wanted? And if I didn't, what do I need to do to make that different? Higher ISO, shorter shutters, you know, longer shutter, different filter. That's kind of how I would get there. We have a question on the swipes.
Do you want me to read it?
And, well, I was backing up to it. Do you ever go back and forth or up and down, or are all of these exposed in one direction? No, I'm almost always in motion. So for me, like my swipes, for the entire length of the shutter, I'm going to be moving, right? Whether it's this motion or if it's a side to side. The only time it's one direction is if I'm panning and I'm picking up my subject and going with them, then that is a single position, right? Like you can't go back and forth in that scenario. You have to pick them up and go with them, or pick them up and go back. So it could be directional, but it's only one swipe. Everything else is a constant motion for the length of the shutter. And I don't know, they're going to be between, again, 1/50th and a couple seconds. I don't have the patience to do this very long. So and at some point you'll start to get wavering. So, you know, whatever that count is, 1 to 10, whatever. But the motion is consistent through the length of the shutter, if that answers your question. If it doesn't, just rephrase the question. I'll try again. Not moving again. Okay, so using filters. So just going to give you some examples of images that were taken with a filter. So here's an example. Like, I will also tell you that unless I tell you otherwise, these are all 10 stop, because again, it's my go-to. This is taken at Alacala Falls in Blackwater State Park in Davis, West Virginia. And this is a 10-second shot, given the light conditions and not a lot of water. So like 10 seconds at Dedi Foss would just be a wall of white coming off of the waterfall. Here, the flow of the water is not so heavy, at least it wasn't at this particular time in fall, that I needed 10 seconds. But you can also see that I was really driving that. So I'm at 7:1, and that's to get the fact that I want the leaves and the rocks in front of me in focus, as well as bulk of the waterfall. You know, for the most part, that waterfall is in focus too. So F7 was giving me the depth, but so I didn't want to go to like F22, and I didn't want to go wide open for a shorter shutter. So the only way I could manipulate the exposure was then by the ISO being 1250. It wouldn't be my go-to, but in that light scenario, and the fact that it was early morning, I needed a higher ISO to stay to 10 seconds. Had I dropped that down, this would have been much too long. I would have had tree movement. I would have been taking up time from somebody else who wanted a shot. So like all of these things are factors when I'm shooting to keep myself moving and make sure that I'm not in people's way, that because these are highly dense populated places anyway. I had like probably 1 or 2 shots at this and that was it. But with that 10 stop, I was limited in what I could manipulate and the triangle, and the easiest thing to manipulate to keep that shutter to 10 seconds is the ISO. This is taken up in Cape May. This is a pier and on a beach. Obviously the tide's in for this shot. So this is about 2 minutes. And again, F9, I wanted to get pretty much everything in the scene to be in focus. So I'm probably focused someplace bottom right third, if you think of the rule of thirds. And then the 9.5 got me past the entire pier, so everything looks like it's sharp. In this particular instance, with a 10 stop, my ISO is down at 50. I had more than enough time, and it was still a 2-minute exposure set that way. But I could bring my ISO all the way down and not have to worry about noise because it was bright enough here. And this is on its way to sunset, although the sun is still up here.
Do you remember?
So this is another.
Sorry, do you remember what lens?
Go ahead.
Do you remember what lens you used for a lot of these, if they're fixed or?
Yeah, so I would say this might be an 18 to 55 because these are Fuji shots. This is probably a 10 to 24 looking at its width, breadth. So would be my guess. That'll probably be the case. This is a 10 to 24. This is Mount Storm. So I was telling you guys about this, another day with great clouds going by. In this particular instance, I probably have a long water shot. I probably have a short shot. I probably had everything in between, but wasn't in any particular hurry to get to Blackwater. And the sky was lovely. So I decided to try this different technique that I had seen. And basically what this is about 100 images. I set this up on an intervalometer. So the camera's on a tripod. I pointed it, I set up my composition and then set the intervalometer to shoot. And when it says 3.5 here for seconds, that's about the average, depending on the light, because I was in aperture mode, the exposure changed a little bit with each shot. And then I just let the camera go. And we probably sat there about a half hour. And at the end of it, I took, and it looks blown out, but again, the actual image is not. I'm really anal about that. But I turned up my screen. So again, I don't know what it looks like for you guys, but my screen looks hot in the middle. But basically what you do at the end of it is now you have this 100 shot, and each one of them in their own right is a picture. It doesn't really matter at all, but you take them into Photoshop, and because it's so many, you can't take them all. Thank you for that, Dan. It's not, you can't take them all into Photoshop. You can't take all 100 in there. Your computer will blow up. So what I would do is take 10, and then I would blend them. And then I would do 10 and 10 and 10. And then at the end, I would take those last sets of 10, that last 10 images, and then blend them all together. And basically what you do is you bring it in and you leave the background as normal. And then every subsequent image above it, you change the mode to lighten, the blend mode to lighten. And in this particular, for this image, it might not work. It depends on what you're shooting. In this image, because the clouds were lighter, the clouds would come through and you're getting this hatcheting of the clouds. And so 100 shots later, this is what you have. Now, I just picked one of those images and then I blended in the foreground again so that I didn't have 100 images of the clouds in the water. Because the water was in motion, boats were going through, I just picked one and I used it as the foreground. So that's how I got the image. But it's just another form of long exposure. You get the sense of the cloud movement here as well. This is taken up at Avalon Pier. Again, it's about 15, 20 minutes outside of Cape May. And it's a sunrise, so you're facing due east here. And what I like about it, so it's about two minutes, just shy of 2 minutes. F16, again, now I'm trying to drive a certain shutter speed, so I've had to bring my ISO up. Now I could have, and my ISO is down. And part of that is that it's very bright. this really cloudless, you can see clouds way, way, way out in the horizon. The sun was coming up, it's coming fast, and the light was getting hot pretty quickly. So in trying to have a reasonable length shutter, I had to manipulate. The f-stop came up, the ISO went down to get there. There's 1,000 different ways this calculation could happen. It just happened how I did it. But what you get out of this image is that you get the sort of water making like fog around the pier pilings, and that's just the waves crashing and coming and going. So Justina, I'll answer your question in a minute. Now, people have asked me, well, why are there ripples? And that's because that's how many waves came through, and there was ripples on the beach, and it just ended up being nice, almost like clear glass, only ripply. It has nothing to do with anything I did. It's just the way that the image came out because of the number of waves that crashed when I took it. So to answer, so Justina's question in the chat is, she's never done any blending, so am I using Photoshop? And yeah, so to do any kind of compositing of images, so whether it's blending images, changing skies, adding a cool woman to a cool background, like Sam might do, any of those kind of things, you need layers. So you cannot do that stuff in Lightroom. There are some other programs that have layers. I find them all 1,000% more difficult than Photoshop, but that's because I know Photoshop really well. So when I'm talking about blending images in this way, I am talking about Photoshop. So you open all 10 images into one tab. So like basically they become one image, and then they show up in your layers panel as, 10 layers. And what you're doing in the case that I was talking about, that other image, the background layer, if you change it at all, you're going to see nothing but transparency. So the background layer is just background, it stays that way. And then each subsequent image, each layer image up, I'm changing a blend mode, which sits over to the right as well. And as I manipulate that blend mode, I'm starting to have interaction between the layers until I get the result that I want. There's other ways to blend, there's other ways to composite. That happens to be the technique to get that cloud. So if you really want to try that cloud out someday, I can give you more set instructions on it.
There were a couple of questions. Do you want me to read them?
Yeah, if you had another one that I missed, yeah, I was sort of seeing them move, but I must have missed it.
One is, do you take into consideration what direction the cloud movement when taking long exposures for the to create leading line?
I don't.
Okay. And then have you?
No, I mean, I guess I might do it intuitively, but not deliberately.
Yeah.
Let me just finish that off too as a thought. I am where I am. So if I'm traveling and this is the moment I have to be in front of this waterfall at this time or this river at this time, I don't have the luxury of that. So I take the shot that I'm trying to take. And if I'm not satisfied with the sky that I have, which happens a lot, this is a great example, totally crappy sky, I cut it out. Like I just don't put it in the shot, I minimize it.
Yeah, okay.
Go ahead.
And then George had another one. Have you found this? Set f-stop between 5.6 to 11. If go higher than f16 to get the color aberration and ghosting. This is more of a comment, sorry, not a question.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I guess the question I would
it's a question for high ND shots like ND10, ND16.
Mm.
Yeah, so on my, yeah, no. So that's why I would go back to using, and I think you actually mentioned that you, what was called Firecrest or something like that. Breakthrough filters do not have color casting. And I don't care if your shutter's open 1.3 seconds like it is here just before dawn, or 5 minutes, 10 minutes, there will be no color casting on a breakthrough filter. And so from a color aberration, I don't experience it. Now, if you're talking about like, where you're getting the green and purples and stuff like that on the edges of dark to light, that'll happen no filter. It has to do with the way the pixels are hitting each other and the lights and the, like a hot light and a dark, like a building against a bright sky. And so that kind of color distortion, you just correct it in post if you happen to even see it. You get it a lot around like leaves on trees and stuff like that. And then I think with ghosting, I mean, I think the only thing that ever really creates ghosting that I've experienced is the fact that the shutter's open long enough that you're getting some kind of movement, whether it's, again, the tripod is moving because of air movement, or if the plants or something in the image itself is moving and you've had the shutter open too long. And so that's really part of the challenge in this photography is, how do I choose between the length of shutter that I might be trying to drive, but all of the other circumstances and elements within the photo that are barring me from getting what I want. And you really have to kind of, it takes multiple images. It takes a lot of like pixel peeping to figure out if you're getting those aberrant things happening. I haven't particularly noticed it, but again, when I used to use Stingray, when I would get upwards of 2 minutes, I would have a magenta picture. And it didn't matter what I did. Oh, you can change that in post. And no, you can't. You can't fix it. It doesn't. You might be able to fix aspects of it, but once that magenta is baked in, I would 9 times out of 10 that image went to black and white. I just said, screw it. I'm not going for color anymore. I like the photo. It's what I had, but I can't get the magenta out, and it's just not worth the time it takes in post to do it. So when I found Breakthrough, that was like manna from heaven. I mean, it just, I take any length I want, and I never give it 2 thoughts about it at all. So Fred, for people who, yes, star stacks. I've used star stacks for stars. I wouldn't use it for other types of blending, but star stacks works for stars. There's another program that works for stars as well. I don't stack images that way as much as I used to, but they would be used for star trails or stacking because you're taking multiple images of the Milky Way and you want to enhance that final image. The star stacks will align the Milky Way and then help it be more dramatic in your image. If you're not using something like an Optron that takes your camera on the path of the Milky Way. So this is just another example, 10 stop, again, sort of similar circumstances to the other one, but now the ISO is up, again, just trying to bring in enough light. This was taken just prior to dawn for Cape May. Just another example of it. This is taken at, in Iceland. This is on that Diamond Beach like I was talking about. And so part of the challenge with an image like this is that, you can see this is actually pretty fast. It's 1.8 seconds. So just shy of 2 seconds. Finding that happy medium. If I were to try to have made this longer, I'd have less activity at the wave level. The icebergs themselves would move and I would have blur on my subjects. You have to find that, sort of saying before, you have to find this like sweet spot between all the elements in the image. And by, manual's a great opportunity because you can manipulate certain aspects to drive exactly what you want. And it's just an example of where it would matter because at some point, these ice blocks are like moving and getting dragged back out into the water. This big one's coming in. I mean, the scene is changing constantly. The other thing is in this moment, I'm able to actually put this camera on like a continuous mode if I want, so that I'm firing off images, getting different pieces of the wave action until I can then come home and pick the one I want to share. If your camera had that noise reduction on, I would take a 1.8 second and then I would sit there for 1.8 seconds. Then I might take another shot and then I would sit there. And that entire time, my scene and the dynamic is changing, and trying to like get that one moment of the wave is a near impossibility. When you trigger that shutter, maybe the wave's coming in, maybe the wave's going out, maybe it's already passed, maybe the icebergs have moved. That noise reduction becomes a hindrance when you're trying to take shots like this where variables are moving. So. Take it in West Virginia. This was just a boring, it's not my favorite shot to start with, but it is an example of a shot that I like more, much like those early shots that we talked about, where the image itself, without the long exposure, the water is, West Virginia water anyway has a very rusty color to it. The trees were moving, and you do see movement in the trees here, but the idea that there's some wind blowing didn't bother me, but they kind of were all over the place. But the water itself was ugly and disgusting. I've never seen water since in this river, and I've never seen it before, which is one of the reasons that we stopped to take the shot. It's on the way up to Dolly Sods. But I decided to put on an ND filter because I thought, well, I'm not liking what I'm getting. It's just awful. It's brown and murky. And then this is the shot that I took, and I actually liked it. It changed. I didn't see through the nasty water. It sort of got this sort of wave action, which I found appealing. So again, just another example of thinking about it differently, because otherwise I would have just never bothered using the pixels. This is taken off of Pfeiffer Beach in Big Sur, and just an example of a wave in that way. And this is an Iceland, waterfall on Iceland. Now in this particular image, again, tack sharp, you wouldn't even really, there wasn't enough water falling that you almost wouldn't have felt like it was a waterfall if it had been at tack sharp or taken at a high shutter. This is 7.5 seconds. That's a pretty long time, and still look at how thin the water is. We can still see through it. So the image would be entirely different if I had taken it with a fast shutter. But the other thing is I went to black and white because behind here, if you look up in the sort of where the top third comes down, there's all kinds of plants back there, and it was all green. And of course, I selectively did not see that when I was taking the shot, but when I got home to process it, I was really distracted. I was looking through this thin water, totally focused on the plants in the background, visually, and black and white really brought out sort of the black cylindrical basalt columns and the way the water moved over them. So for me, black and white was the way to go in this image. Also taken in West Virginia, just another example. Now in this particular instance, it's not Alacala. I don't even know that it has a name. It's off of a fire road. 10 seconds, but what was cool is if you have pools of water, so in this case, the water was pooling before it went down to the next cascade, this started making a vortex in the pooling water. So there's nothing I did to this. It basically is this waterfall coming down. And again, West Virginia water is great for this because it is foamy and weird. So the foam itself is making the swirls. There are other photographers. I know that Joe Rossbach, he'll throw fall leaves into this and get these beautiful trails of gold and yellow in the whirling pool. So some ideas that you could play with if you were up in this environment and you saw this happening. But a long exposure gives you that cool circular motion. Another shot of Iceland, and again, just different use of long exposure. So using low light, taking advantage of your situation. This is actually taken in a slow shutter app on my phone, but this is taken in China. And in this particular instance, I couldn't really drag the shutter, so it's taken. I kind of used the app to kind of create the effect, but what you're really getting the sense of motion is just by people moving, and it was really low light. So it's just the fact that I'm taking advantage of the opportunity because I did no filter for that, didn't have a tripod. So it's sort of using the technique and trying to find an app that would give me a long enough exposure to get what I wanted in that environment. This was taken off of the Merry Grand in DC. I believe it was the one in DC. And just kept trying to shoot until I could get one of the horses on the merry-go-round kind of in focus, but get the sense of motion. No filter. That's why I'm up at f20, and this particular camera, ISO 100 is the lowest I could go. I'm not really particularly long, but that merry-go-round's going fast enough that that you get the sense of motion. So we all know that this merry-go-round's in motion right now, right? The difference between taking it fast. So this is taken outside of Lake Mavaten, just kind of past Lake Mavaten on the east of Mavaten in Iceland. And we were shooting, this is a thermal area. So even though you see a little bit of thermal area in the foreground here, back corner off my left is this whole thermal landscape with, steam vents and all this stuff happening. We've been out there shooting. It's actually getting really late. I was waiting for dawn to come in, and I saw a car go up this road, and I hadn't really thought about it before. I've been on this road many times, and it didn't really occur to me that it's this beautiful S-curve. And I was like, oh my God, what a cool shot. Normally you have to be up in the Sierras in California to get these shots. So I started playing with it. But if anybody the crowd here has been to Iceland, you kind of know you could wait for hours before you see another car. It doesn't happen overnight. Like, they don't come with any kind of regularity. We're in the middle of nowhere. So when Don came in, I said, hey, you know, check out that really cool S-curve. You know, if you really need it, there was a car on it. And he was like, yeah, it's really neat. I'm like, well, how about you drive up and down the road until I get the photo I want? And so, and he was game. So he got in the car. I took both of our cameras. I had the remote triggers. And basically, we communicated via phone. And he would drive up and he would drive down and he would drive up and he would drive down. And I don't know, probably a half hour later, I finally said I was happy. But I had him go back and forth a number of times, and I triggered for both of us so that we both had the images. But it ended up being kind of a cool shot. It took about almost 30 seconds for the car to pass the entire length. And you know, to get sort of the full S in one kind of curve. But light trails, car trails are another really cool aspect. So this is another shot taken again with a slow shutter app on the phone. This is taken with my phone held up against a window on the 3rd Ring Road in Beijing. And yeah, I mean, I just picked a 10-second shutter. Probably could have gotten away with 5, but I like car trails. Like, I think that's a really neat effect, and I think it's just another kind of cool aspect of the urban landscape is the density and the massive cars on the road. So I dig that. This is taken in Pittsburgh up off of Grand View, overlooking sort of the water and where the ballpark is. And we had taken shots of fireworks. The fireworks were over at the end of the game, and we were just walking back, and I sort of saw these lights, and cars were coming and going, and I decided it'd be another cool opportunity. So again, not using a filter, but taking advantage of the fact that it's a low light scenario, set the camera back down on the tripod and just started shooting. Even here in this environment, this late at night, I still had to hit F22 to get a long enough exposure to not get the car in the shot. So that's why I was trying to get to 8 seconds. I mean, it could have been 8, could have been 10, didn't matter. But I was trying to get the effect of the car and anything shorter, I was getting the car in it, or it wasn't getting enough light drag in the image. So the solution was bring my ISO down as far as it was going to go on that body and take the f-stop all the way up to condense the aperture and to get to at least where I needed to get. Another long exposure created just by the ambient light. In this case, the light is being created because this is pre-dawn. This is the same Avalon Pier that I talked about a minute ago, only taken from the side. And we just got out there early. We were going to wait for the sunrise, and yet, you know, you're there, so like, why not shoot? So in this case, it was really dark, so I'm kind of taking advantage of that. But it was funny because I was taking a bunch of shots and I wasn't really paying much attention, but I realized it was spritzing. I didn't have my lens hood on. So I look at my camera and there's water on the front element. So I cleaned it off and I take a bunch more shots. When I got home, the image that I liked was this one. And the spectral highlights here are created by raindrops. So kind of a cool effect, a happy happenstance that it worked out this way. The images that I never used were the ones with the lens clean. So I just like the effect of it. But again, taking advantage of the moment. Similar scenario here. If you look really closely, I'm assuming this is going to come through on your screens, but you see that there's like little white dashes in the sky. Those white dashes are stars. This big wide open, this is a 10 to 24. So at 10 seconds, for whatever reason, I was getting star trails off my stars. This was taken about 1 o'clock in the morning in the Palouse. So you can sort of see the rolling hills here and the farmhouse over to the right in the bottom corner. Our light source in the clouds is actually a full moon. And I drugged Dawn out of bed in the middle of the night because I didn't want to go by myself. You know, I didn't not quite that daring to go stand out in the dark by myself and take photos. But I'm like, come on, I want to go do some night photography and let's see what we get. And at the end of the day, actually, I really dug the effect. I like all that green that you see in the bottom, that's all being lit by the moon. And you get this cloud motion from just the fact that there was wind in the sky at the high levels. And then you get these star trails. It's just a totally different effect, completely created just by the time of day. Another example of a long exposure image. This is 25 seconds. I don't know if anybody here, I know a couple people on this call have seen spinning wool, but that's basically what this is. It's called spinning wool. And you basically take, it's like a wool gauze that you stuff into a whisk, and then you light it on fire and you spin it around. So this is hot molten metal that's flying towards the cameras. You have to make sure you've got enough distance so you're protecting yourself. This was taken up at Cary Furnace, which is a steel furnace in outside of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. And Jeff Johnson, as we lovingly call him, brother, he is the former president of the club, so a lot of you guys know him. That's him standing in the middle. So you see those legs, that's Jeff, and he's all bundled up and he's like spinning this thing and it's flying all over the place. But again, this is pitch black outside of the fact that he's creating this light from this metal that's on fire. Okay, so we're coming down to the home stretch here. So the idea of creating motion by lens manipulation, a totally different way of getting a feeling of motion. This was taken at Cary Furnace. This was taken during the middle of the day, and this is a barrel twist. So it's actually a 10-second exposure with like a really slow turn on the barrel of a telephoto lens, and it gives you that feeling. Like we were laughing when we first got on the call because I rolled back to look out a window, and it's sort of the same effect. It's like telescoping effect, right? Like to me, looks like I'm going into this demon portal, right? These big red eyes and this round mouth and this kind of on my way to some sinister place. But you get the sense of motion, the feeling of the old screensavers with the stars moving past you. This is self-portrait. This is taken at St. Albans Asylum down near Roanoke. And I obviously wasn't, it was my concept, but Jeff, my Jeff was manipulating the barrel, same idea. What I was trying to get was this effect of, the sort of the terror, the mania of being in an asylum. And I was trying to create that look by having this motion effect coming off the lens. A set of poplar trees in the Palouse, same kind of just barreling effect here, although you can do a lot of cool things with it. I don't have the other image, but I do have one where not only was I twisting the barrel, but I also arced the camera, and you ended up with like a path that ended up taking a turn. So there's all kinds of cool stuff, and it's literally just about experimenting and seeing what you can do. And it's funny because I mentioned the doing it in Photoshop. I don't even have the photo in here, but you can use one of the filters like for a radio blur, and it can either be a shape like this, it can be circular, or it can be linear depending on your choices. And you can kind of create blur that way. And I did that for a static image that I had of two dogs in the front seat of one dog in the front seat of a car, one in the back. So it looked like driving this daisy moment. But I wanted to give the effect like the car was actually in motion because the dog was in the driver's seat, but obviously the car was not in motion. So I took the image, I duplicated it, and duplicated the layer. I blurred the bottom layer, and then I put the dog driving through the image that showed motion. So you can do that in Photoshop, but it doesn't have any of the same effects and feel. So you're not going to fool anybody with trying to like create that kind of motion in a waterfall in post. The only way you're going to get that feeling is by taking the time to stand there and put a filter on and shoot the image. So like I said, when you're out in those environments and you have that minute, take the shot the way you were going to take it and start experimenting with different exposure lengths and see what you come up with. And there's just all kinds of creative things I think you can do with it. So that's it. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I think Sam was probably, or no, maybe not. I would say, are you recording it, Sam?
Yeah, we're recording.
Okay, that's it.
Anybody
If people wanted the slides, then you can see that.
Oh, true. If anybody has any questions, just unmute yourself. No questions?
So I'll break some ice. So Denise, Roadrunner Photography Tours, do you guys do any particular trips, or have you done any particular trips where any of these techniques are a major part of those trips?
Every single image, that I can't speak to the camera shake ones of Don's because I think those were done locally, but every single image here, every single one of those came off of a trip for Roadrunner. So whether that was a local or international. And so the short answer is yes. Like, we're landscape photographers, so we tend to be in positions and in places that lend themselves to these environments to these types of images, and we'll help you. Like, we'll teach you how to do it. So if you don't have the gear, but you want, like, that happens a lot. Like, people are kind of new and they come out and they hadn't thought about it. You know, we try to tell people to bring it, but it's a big investment. And if you don't know if you're going to like it, you know, I can see, you know, I don't want to spend a couple $100 if I have no idea, if I don't think I'm going to do it. So it's not unusual to have people come out. Because we have step-up rings, the beauty of that is that because we have them, we can fit our filters on just about everybody's lens, unless you had an 82, and now I can do that. So the short answer is, yeah, we're constantly in places where being able to take images like this, our trips lend themselves to this stuff. But if you were coming out on a trip and you weren't 100% sure and you wanted to experiment, you know, we'll teach you how to do it. And if you had your own gear and you just didn't know how to use it because it was new to you, we would take the time to help you and teach you. And, you know, if you don't have the right tripod, you know, we always like give up our tripods. You know, I have like 200, 300,000 images. Like, it's okay if I go someplace and I don't take a picture. So our goal is to teach people and to give them the opportunity to experiment and learn and, you know, build memories and stuff like that. So the short answer is yes, all the time. Thanks for asking.
Denise, is there a particular app that you like for the iPhone? I mean, for the phone that you use? Some of the
it's called, so on the iPhone, yeah, it's called Slow Shutter, actually. Let me just triple check that, but I'm pretty sure that's actually what it's called. Yeah, it's really kind of going to be hard to show you because I don't think my phone, see the back, let me change something. The background doesn't like me to show my phone. That's how that works. So now you're going to see my office. Okay, so if you see that way, see the little purple one, it says Slow Shutter,
Okay.
and it looks like an aperture ring. Yeah, that's the app that I use. And then when you go into it, it just looks like boring, right? But if you go into the settings, it's going to be hard for you to see, but you can kind of drag it. So that's set for 2 seconds right now. And so you can manipulate it. It goes up to 10. I don't know, it might go even higher than that. It goes up to bulb mode. There you have it. 60 seconds, 30 seconds. So if you had a holder like a Me Photo makes a holder for phones, not just for iPhones, but for phones, you could set this up, you know, start the shutter and it'll just take a 30-second image. Got to keep in mind that there are limitations to how this works. And let me see if I can find an image that I took with that in particular that gives a better sense. There is, because your camera doesn't really have a shutter that's opening and closing, the phone doesn't, it is like a scanner. So the effect is a little bit different. So I've never really tried to take a super long exposure with it. But I do play with it. I just posted something recently on Facebook and I'm just trying to see if I can kick it out of my
Was the one that you took
photos
off
on my phone.
the back of the metro train, was
Yes.
that the cell phone?
Yeah.
Because
Yes.
that one was
So
pretty.
here is, it is one of my, I love these shots. I don't like that one. Okay. So this image is taken, trying to get that straight, with that slow shutter off the back of, it's not it's the metro, but it's the train that's at the airport. And basically you just like press it up against the window so it doesn't move. And as soon as the thing takes off, you know, you hit go and it's, I think it's like a couple seconds and you get that warping feeling.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah. Yep. Thank you, Dan. And Dan said that they found the best one. Is that, so when you say the best one for Android, it's called ND Expert. Is that a slow shutter or an ND time calculator? You're going to have to answer that question because I'm not sure what you're trying to tell him.
Time. He said time.
Oh, okay. So it's the time one. There. Is that what you wanted, Ruth? I got to think about where that just went. I'll give you a speaker. Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
Hey Denise, just a question on your beach pictures with the waves. I know you said that as far as the waves coming in or out, that might be hit or miss till you get the picture that you really like. But do you find that the pictures work out better with the slow shutter with the waves going back out or more in?
You know, it's funny. I would say that probably most of my pictures, the waves in the early years, let me change it around, particularly the iceberg waves, I would say the images are, the wave is going out, right? But some of my favorite pictures taken by other photographers are the wave coming in. And it took, it took sort of experimenting and not liking what I was seeing, not dislike, liking isn't the right word, but not being as enthusiastic about my images and thinking, why am I not getting what I want? And then starting to go look at other people's images and seeing how they took them. And you start to realize, oh, those waves are coming in, not going out. And so I think you really just have to sort of experiment. And I'm speaking actually specifically about Iceland when I'm talking about that. The under the pier, you know, that was a long enough shutter that the wave was doing what the wave was doing. I had very little to say about it. The rolling wave on the little pier pilings that I said, you know, here's a sky that's been, we were talking about skies, and I said, here's an example of the sky that I cut out. But there's like these like little pier pilings, short ones, and then there's a big rolling wave behind it that's coming in. Yeah, and that was up in Cape May, but it sort of just depends, and I think that's part of it is you have to be patient enough to like take them in both directions, right? You might get lucky and nail it off of one or two shots, but I think you actually kind of have to sit there and, you know, move around, find a different little iceberg, you know, play with it, see what really looks good for each scene, because I don't know that it's always one way or another.
All right, thanks.
But I can tell you, I tried only going out, and I didn't. At the end of the day, I started experimenting coming in, and I had more that I liked. So.
Oh, yeah. All right, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. So the comment to everyone says, waves coming in show more motion, and the waves come in and out during exposure. So there you have with that. Thank you, Jess. So anybody else before we let you all go for the evening? I want to thank you for joining me on this adventure. Thank you, Sam, for inviting me to speak to Club. I miss everybody. I don't miss you enough to move back, but I do miss you. Let me put my view back up so you know why I feel that way.
It was really great.
It was great to see you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Take care, everybody. Be well.
You
Okay.
too. Thank you.
Thank you. And competition in 2 weeks.
All right. What's the theme? What's the theme? Jeff
macro.
asked me and I didn't know.
It's macro.
Macro. Okay. Okay. Yep. We'll have to go play around then.
Yeah.
All right, kids.
So
take care.
Speaking of macro, is there any kind of workshop or?
We were going to do that live. And the weather, I was actually going to suggest getting small groups together this weekend, but it looks like the weather might be bad because the county parks are open, and there are a lot of good little weed flowers still out there. So we'll just have to look for good weather and whatever.
So are you guys looking to do anything, you know, like any of the Zoom meetings or anything like that, or are any of those about, or is it just the abstract one that you got coming up?
Well, I have some macro slides that I'm running by Denise, and I ran it by another group, and it's more of a like how things work and what to get and where to begin, and then a little bit of editing. So I could throw it together and share that maybe during the week, but maybe in a week or so. I can try. So.
That's nice.
Okay. Is that it?
All right.
Thank you.
Night, kids.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.